Hello again, and in this third and last presentation for this week, I want to give you an overview of the way that we're going to be approaching some of the issues that we're looking at, issues that I think are fundamental to the understanding of Southeastern Europe. And I should say beforehand, some of what I am going to say involves hypotheses that are generally accepted in the field. Some of the things I'm going to say are a little bit specific and idiosyncratic. They involve the approach that I take to the field, and none of what I am going to say is meant to be exhaustive. There is quite a lot that needs to be considered in the field, and in the few minutes that I have to give an overview, I'm not going to present everything, but other approaches are of course possible. So, first of all, we're going to be looking at the politics of Southeast Europe since 1990. I believe that's the title of the seminar. From the 1990s onward, some of the dominant concerns have to do with conflict, with violence, with nationalism, with the emergence of ideologies, some of which are extreme. These are, without meaning to be cynical, often the principal reasons that people have an interest in the region at all. I think it's important to take a step back and not to look at any of these issues in a vacuum, to understand what happened in the period from 1990 onward, and especially the conflicts of the 1990s. It's important to understand something about earlier political conflicts in the region, and it's important to understand something about the origin of divisions in the societies that are involved. I think you'll find a lot of hypotheses that will tell us that much of the conflict has to do with rapid and incompletely absorbed urbanization and modernization, and the consequent conflicts that developed between urban and rural populations and between urban and rural political and cultural orientations. And without understanding this basic fact, this background fact, it can be very difficult to understand some of the contemporary conflicts that are not always expressed in that language. Second, although we tend to use violence and conflict and ethnic division as a kind of shorthand for understanding the dynamics of the region, we need to understand that these ethnic sources of division and the intensity of these sources do not represent feelings that are universally shared among all people in the region. There are people who were very strongly attracted by conflict. Those are some of the loudest voices in the region still, and there are others who were not. And we want to know about this difference, people attracted by conflict and people not attracted by conflict, and where it comes from, who are the people in these different camps, and why they are there, and what are the possibilities for future development. A third point about violence. When we talk about the consequences of violence, and it's difficult to talk about the consequences of violence objectively, but here's something we can say that is a little bit objective. Violence was very bad for most people who experienced it, and extraordinarily good, extraordinarily profitable for some people. For some people, it put them in positions of power in which some of them remain. So this basic fact about violence, the divisions that violence comes out of and the divisions that violence produces, has produced some legacies that continue to be influential in post-war politics. And we should keep in mind when we talk about post-war and post-conflict environments, it's over 20 years since the end of the last violent conflict in the region, and still it's the structuring fact for understanding a lot of the politics in conflict, and it might be important in a lot of instances to ask why that's the case. That's not the case with every conflict. I can offer some additional points, particularly about the period after the end of the conflicts of the 1990s, and one of them is that Southeast Europe became a kind of target area, a testing ground, a lab for different kinds of post-conflict intervention and for different strategies for the development of democracy, civil society, reconciliation, in any number of goals, some of which were also economic. And a lot of what was tried about after other recent conflicts, after conflicts in places like Iraq, Libya, other states where there was regime change, was built on experience that was developed through experimentation in Southeast Europe, and that makes it especially interesting and possibly important for us to evaluate some of those projects and try to get a deep understanding of them and get a sense of where they succeeded and also where they failed. Uh, One of those forms of intervention that was constructed largely, not entirely, but largely on the experience of Southeast Europe is the project of so-called transitional justice or post-conflict justice, and projects related to public memory and the politicization of public memory, the use of public memory in the interest of reconciliation, the reasons why some people in that part of the world come to reject concepts like reconciliation in a way that is uniquely grounded in our experience. This experience in Southeast Europe might be very important. It might also not be important. It might be unique in terms of how some legal questions, some political questions, and some moral questions are considered in the future. Another fact about the post-conflict period is that Southeast Europe produced a relatively large number of new states in a relatively short period of time. All of these new states were founded on some variation of a principle of nationality or ethnicity as a unifying concept with unique consequences. And so it becomes an interesting place to look at the way that ideas of nationality and ethnicity develop as they become founding principles of states in a short period of time, in a compressed way, and in a way that's structured more by the experience of the 21st century than of the 19th century, which is the case with most national states. The other interesting thing about these states is that as soon as they were formed, they came into immediate interaction with some interstate organizations, international organizations, with international standards as they were developing, and so the conflicts that developed were potentially very interesting. Uh, some points to keep in mind as we look at these states and as we try to consider these interesting and possibly unique facts. First, always keep in mind that we are looking at societies. And although it's popular to adopt the approach of a lot of journalism to look at what high officials, what governments are doing, and say this is the position of the whole society, remember always that societies are divided, that structures of power paper over that division. Second, you look at institutions, and especially in institutions in states that are not bureaucratically very dense. They are in a constant state of development and change, and we're able to observe that development and change. And this can tell us something about institutions not only in the region, but also more generally. Third, we need to always keep in mind there is a distinction between state and society, and states and society are in interaction with one another, and the interaction between states and societies is probably very important to the kind of understanding that we can develop with the region. It is also meaningful how the states in the region and the societies in the region interact with states and institutions that are more influential and more powerful than they are internationally. And while doing that, we also want to keep in mind how they interact with one another and how they interact with states and institutions that are less powerful. In many respects, the standards by which interaction will be measured because of the character of the international environment at the time when these states entered a period of rapid transformation are standards that have been established in advance and are relatively inflexible. And this has a particular set of consequences that'll be especially important when we talk about these states in relation to interstate institutions and organizations like the European Union and some others. So what all of this comes down to is we're talking about an environment where change has been fairly rapid, resistance to change has been fairly intense, and the speed of the change and the kind of environment in which change occurs is relatively unique. And it's one reason why we need to keep perspectives open. And one perspective that we probably need to keep open more than any others is the ways in which states and societies are in interaction and sometimes in conflict with one another. But we'll be looking at those themes, each of them, in great detail every time we go into empirical cases, which we'll be doing starting next week.